Okay, so this is a talk that's in two parts. It's about Anna Barbauld, who came to live in Stoke Newington in 1802. And what I'm going to talk about is who Anna Barbauld was before she came to Stoke Newington and what she was doing in Stoke Newington. So beginning with her birth in 1743. 1743 was a good time to be born female with intellectual and literary ambitions, especially if, like Anna Aikin, as she was, especially if you were born into English Protestant dissent. Dissenters were those who dissented from the Church of England as the established church, married to the state. Dissenters were tolerated. They were outsiders, not rebels, but outsiders, barred from a huge range of positions carrying income and status. They couldn't serve in the military, nor attend the two universities. As it happens, the two universities were pretty moribund in the 18th century, and dissenters established their own schools, which were better. A famous one in Hackney, one in Warrington, and Kibworth, south of Leicester, where Anna Barbauld's father, John Aikin, opened a school and where Anna Letitia was born. Shortly afterwards, he moved to Warrington to lead the academy there. Two things about this background in dissent are important in relation to Anna Letitia Barbauld. First of all, for the most part, there was a commitment to educating their daughters as well as their sons. This was generally true, and it took a especially strong form for Anna Letitia, who grew up in a school alongside succeeding generations of boys. She didn't have lessons with them, but she was involved. She taught the younger boys when she was old enough. She helped put on plays and so on, mixed with the masters and their wives, and altogether the school was her social environment, and her social and intellectual formation was as one of them. She was the only girl, had no sisters, imbibing masculine privilege, you could say. The word masculine was later used of her writing. I think this formation is important. She was a bit of a star at Warrington. Nobody told her she shouldn't be reading and writing and having opinions. Everybody had opinions at Warrington, especially about politics. And those opinions were respected by heavyweight intellectuals like Joseph Priestley, who was one of the teachers at Warrington. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that dissenters believed that authority was not something to be blindly obeyed. They believed in community spirit, fellow feeling, and that everybody had a duty to do what was right to help others. Things that were wrong needed to be challenged, to be made right. And it was not acceptable to blame God or providence or whatever. Human action for good and ill made a difference. Fundamentally, they believed humans could and should be good to each other, that they lived in a progressive era. The dark ages of ignorance were behind, and humanity was moving forward into glorious enlightenment. Dissenters went into business, trade, education, often developing family concerns in which women would play a part. By the end of the 18th century, they were the biggest significant group in the literary establishment, running the major periodicals, confident and with access to public opinion. Anna Letitia's brother, John Aikin, became a significant figure on the literary scene. He saw his endeavours as a family affair, working in collaboration with his sister, always urging her on, and later getting his children involved. There was nothing surprising about this amongst dissenters, although it was obviously helpful to her as a budding literary figure. Anna Letitia became a major literary figure in her early 20s. That didn't mean moving out of the family orbit or the wider social world of dissent. Her first big splash was a poem about the Corsican fight for independence from the Republic of Genoa and the threatening French. She wrote this poem, Corsica, after reading James Boswell's 1768 book and following his press campaign in support of the Corsican patriots and General Pascal Pioli. The poem was, I quote, openly, not secretly, insurrectionary. With this poem, Corsica, she was participating in imagination in London opposition politics. She sent it to Joseph Priestley. He sent it to others. It found its way to London. This is how a poem would circulate and a reputation would grow. Miss Aikin of Warrington was already a known quantity when a few years later she published a volume of her poetry. You think about the way that poetry worked at this time. The poem would go round, people would copy it into their commonplace books, and they would be read out at social events. Someone else would copy it, and so it would, send it on in a letter to somebody else, and that's how a reputation grew. So in the second half of 1772, she gathered her poems together and sent them to Joseph Johnson, the radical publisher in London. Poems by Miss Aikin appeared in January 1773. It was a large quarto, handsome volume costing 6 shillings. Corsica is the first poem in it. And that volume was immediately recognised as an important volume, regarded as essential reading. The first edition of 500 sold out by April, so that's in 3 months. That edition had sold out. A second edition was gone by September. Its popularity can be measured by figures from the Bristol Circulating Library between 1773 and 1784. She was in the top 15% of all titles borrowed from that library. This is the volume of her first poems. The book made her a national celebrity. Yeah. The London literati, including Blue Stockings, led by Elizabeth Montagu and Elizabeth Carter, welcomed her in. All the evidence, such as it is, suggests that she enjoyed this experience of fame, but she didn't go to London. Instead, in 1774, she got married and moved to a Suffolk village. She was almost 30. Her husband, Letitia Barbauld, was a dissenting minister of French parentage, educated at her father's Warrington school. So she'd known him as a boy. He was a few years younger than her. The couple went to Palgrave outside Diss, and there they together ran a boys' school very successfully for 10 years. They had no children, but she adopted her nephew, Charles, and wrote Lessons for Children, 1778, and Hymns in Prose for Children, 1781, which were addressed to him and inspired by him. Some people, for example, Samuel Johnson, were surprised that the famous intellectual Mrs. Barbauld should stoop to writing for children. In fact, what she was doing was innovative work. Charles, the real Charles, was an early version of the child who became known as a symbol of childhood. Think of Christopher Robin, when A. Milne wrote him into Winnie the Pooh. So you've got an early version of that. She liked children, she liked young people, she liked their energy and anarchic humour. And I think it's worth remembering this because some of the later characterizations of her suggested a dry, stern, reproving, humourless, blue-stocking type. And remember, after the 1790s, the term blue-stocking became a misogynistic term of abuse, and perhaps it still carries a bit of that. In 1785, the Barbaulds closed their school, and soon after they settled in Hampstead, where she continued to take in pupils, girls rather than boys, on an informal basis. The girls would live in and learn from her conversation and her guidance. It was during this time in Hampstead that Anna Barbauld's concerns as a writer became overwhelmingly political. She emerged in the 1790s as a committed pamphleteer, using her writing in verse and prose for political activism. And I'll talk now briefly about 3 pamphlets from the 1790s. The first one, the address to the opposers of the repeal of the Corporation and Test Acts. It's a bit of a mouthful. The address to the opposers of the repeal of the Corporation and Test Acts. There had been various attempts to get the laws regarding dissenters changed so that they could obtain full civil rights, and none has succeeded. In early 1790, another attempt was made. When this was voted down, a huge pamphlet war broke out. Barbauld's address to the opposers of the repeal of the Corporation and Test Acts was among them, an angry response to a lifetime of marked and separated status. She argued that dissenters did not want to be distinguished by dissent. They wanted to be full citizens. An interesting term, fully current at the time in French revolutionary rhetoric. Radicals in England supported the revolution openly at this stage. But among the early acts of revolutionaries in France was confiscation of the property of the church. This was anarchy, according to Edmund Burke, one of the opposers. In England, since church and state were one, mobs in the streets carried placards, church and king. To be for the church was to be for the king and vice versa, and dissenters were not for the church. So events in France coloured debates about religious tolerance and political equality for dissenters in England. When radicals in Birmingham held a dinner in July 1791 to celebrate the second anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, church and king mobs rioted for 4 days, targeting the houses of known dissenters. Joseph Priestley's house was burned down and everything in it was lost. Altogether, 20 buildings were destroyed or damaged. Many dissenters had already emigrated to America, and Priestley and his wife Mary, who were very close friends of the Barbaulds, did likewise. The future looked bleak for those who hoped to do away with the old order, which based respect of man for man on entrenched privilege and religious distinctions. Though Barbauld's pamphlet was judged, I quote, one of the best specimens of declamatory composition we have ever seen by the Analytic Review, the conservative press was not swayed. Those who had loved the poems of Miss Aikin, sweetly singing, felt betrayed by the forthright, angry voice of the pamphleteer. Till Mary Wollstonecraft came along, Anna Barbauld served as the wicked woman in the conservative imagination. The second pamphlet I'm going to talk about is the Epistle to William Wilberforce, 1791, the following year. And this, of course, relates to the slave trade and anti-slavery. The campaign against the slave trade began in the 1780s. There were sermons, tracts and poems by those who wanted to rouse the feelings of the nation against the trade in people kidnapped in Africa. Britain was a leading slave trader, a country whose wealth was in many ways driven by the business of slavery. There had been disquiet before the 1780s, but the argument was always that if Britain didn't do it, our economic rivals, France and Spain, would step in and they would treat the kidnapped Africans even worse. In May 1789, William Wilberforce opened the campaign in Parliament, and a parliamentary committee was set up which took evidence over the next 2 years. On the basis of this evidence, Wilberforce moved in April 1791 that the trade be outlawed. He had Fox and Pitt, the two great orators, on his side. But the opposition argued that slavery was sanctioned in the Bible, that it had been practiced throughout history, and the enslaved people were happy and well looked after. Above all, they argued for the rights of property. As one parliamentarian put it, it would be, I quote, a mistaken humanity in these enlightened times to allow property to be attacked and risk the livelihoods of sailors, shipbuilders and owners, import-export businesses, and so on. The opposition won comfortably by a majority of almost 2-1. In spite of the horrors which Wilberforce and his committee had uncovered and made public, most MPs were prepared to disregard the suffering and the depravity and, in the name of God, prefer profits and gain. The debate was published, and Barbauld must have sat down and written her verse epistle to William Wilberforce immediately after reading it. This was published in mid-June as a quarto pamphlet priced 1 shilling. She didn't know Wilberforce. The poem was a public address to a public figure on a matter of national importance. The poetic voice is severe, angry, denunciatory, and it passes judgment on a nation that had made a disgraceful decision. You can feel the shock in the opening lines. The poem begins, "Cease, Wilberforce, to urge thy generous aim. Thy country knows the sin and stands the shame." What's really shocking to her is that the suffering and injustice had been clearly laid before people's eyes, and it didn't make them feel the wrong sufficiently to want to make it stop. They still said that profits mattered more. The evil was defended by daring lies, sophistry, artful interpretations, and in the end, brazen acceptance that gain was God. At one heartrending description of cruelty to an African mother and baby, someone in the House of Commons had apparently laughed. What is distinctive about the poem, amongst all the anti-slavery literature of the time, is Barbauld's angry disbelief that right thinking, right feeling had not prevailed. To her, there was an obvious and clearly laid out moral decision to be taken, a right decision, yet the nation's parliament had deliberately chosen the path of evil. The political class, instead of leading the nation ethically, had chosen to be unethical. For liberal thinkers, progressives, moralists like Anna Barbauld, there was a lot at stake, no less than the future of liberalism and its commitment to progress in a country whose self-image, remember, was dedicated to doing good. The third pamphlet is called Sins of Government, Sins of the Nation, 1793. When France declared war on England in 1793, the king did what governments customarily did at the outset of a war. He declared a day of public fasting and humiliation. In other words, the public were to show abasement to the Almighty, so he would look favourably on English arms and ammunition by land and sea. All loving subjects were expected to observe the fast. There were special prayers for the day. Barbauld and other dissenters deplored the war. What were they to do? Barbauld wrote a shilling tract, Sins of Government, Sins of the Nation, or a Discourse for the Fast, appointed on Aikin 19th, 1793. Until now, she wrote, life in Britain had shown a smooth progress towards ever greater enlightenment and freedom, and because of that, our political duties had been proportionately easy. Now it did not seem to be the case any longer. Faced with the turmoil of the times, everybody had a responsibility to examine their principles. As they were all summoned to fast, so they were all, therefore, involved in the guilt or sin of the nation. She thought it was a bad war, and when she looked back in history, she saw a series of bad wars. And although she doesn't argue for pure pacifism, she's strongly anti-war. In words that I find strongly resonant for our own time. I'll quote you a bit from this pamphlet. She writes, when we carry our eyes back through the long records of our history, we see wars of plunder, wars of conquest, wars of religion, wars of pride, wars of succession, wars of idle speculation, wars of unjust interference, and hardly among them one war of necessary self-defense in any of our essential or very important interests. Of late years, indeed, we have known none of the calamities of war in our own country, but the wasteful expense of it. And sitting aloof from these circumstances of personal provocation, which in some measure might excuse its fury, we have calmly voted slaughter and merchandised destruction. So much blood and tears for so many rupees or dollars or ingots. What she mostly attacked was the impiety of calling on God to assist us in the work of slaughter. And as for the hypocrisy of appearing shocked at the atheism of revolutionary France, whilst ignoring our own crimes against humanity, such as the slave trade, that was unconscionable. The anger that led her to write Epistle to William Wilberforce was still boiling when Barbauld wrote Sins of Government, Sins of the Nation. And it is to some extent a development from it. She imagines the loss of precious liberty in the conclusion of this pamphlet, a growth of arbitrary power in a country moving steadily to the right. She sees future generations cursing the folly of their forefathers who allowed this to happen through complacency, through weak principles, or greed and selfishness. She imagines, in other words, the loss of liberal values. I think we can say she was quite prescient in this. So part 2 takes us from 1802 to 1825. Public events in the repressive 1790s and early 1800s, these public events pained her. The war that had begun in 1793 seemed never ending. There were poor harvests and ever-rising taxation to pay for the war. The window tax, which led people to brick up their windows, seems particularly symbolic of the darkening mood. bankruptcies were almost commonplace. Changing ministries revolved the same incompetent politicians, none of whom had a clue what to do. Only Nelson's victories at sea gave any grounds for cheer and kept Britain safe from invasion by Napoleon. The news from the land war was uniformly bad. The retreat from Corunna and John Moore's death in 1808, the unparalleled disaster of the Valturin expedition in 1809. Meanwhile, more troops were deployed to contain industrial unrest in the Midlands and the North in 1811 and 1812 than had been sent to Spain and Portugal. The economy and political system seemed on the verge of collapse. Britain, once the ruler of a proud empire, now weakened both within and without, was apparently in a state of terminal decline. 1811 was also the year that King George III's madness, or dementia, became permanent and a constitutional crisis erupted around the decision to make the Prince of Wales regent. Anna Barbauld moved to Stoke Newington Church Street to be close to her brother John Aikin and his family. She pursued literary projects that brought a good income and high status. Rochmont, her husband, had a position at Newington Green Chapel, another reason for the move. And at this point, it's worth saying that there are massive gaps in our knowledge of Anna Barbauld's life, partly because the vast mass of her papers were destroyed by bombing in the Blitz in 1940. What we know is that she was a respected figure in the literary firmament, looked up to as a moral leader. She spent her days busily writing, including writing letters, reading, teaching, visiting. She was immensely sociable. One very small diary of engagements that survives shows an inordinate amount of visiting back and forth and people staying with them in the large house. She had no love of solitude. There were travels, young women staying to be educated, and she started a women-only reading group in the neighbourhood. Anna Barbauld's marriage had unquestionably been a successful partnership that she valued. But in these early years in Stoke Newington, her personal life had darkened too. Rochmont Barbauld had suffered periodically from mental ill health, which he and she had mostly managed. But his behaviours were becoming more extreme and hard to hide. Among other symptoms, he had a washing compulsion and would sometimes spend literally the whole day washing, and if interrupted in his ritual, could be violent. The violence has become more marked. There were numerous episodes. In 1808, he attacked his wife and chased her across Church Street. It took a servant and a baker's boy to subdue him, and a dose of laudanum. Later that year, he threw himself into the New River and drowned. So private and public darkness combined over the next few years. Depressed and at times despairing, the widowed Anna Barbauld adjusted as best she could. Bit by bit, the energy to engage as a poet on the public stage came back. The war, she believed, needed to end. Europe had fallen to Napoleon's colossal power, and British policy had been ineffective. Barbauld wanted a negotiated settlement and an end to the war, on the grounds that war itself had already destroyed what was best in the nation. Oppressed and depressed, she wrote a poem named for the wretched year, 1811. 1811 has a significant place in Barbauld's oeuvre, for it is generally acknowledged as not only her finest poem, the crowning production of a stellar career as a respected woman of letters, but as the work which, because of the hostile reception it received, bankrupted her reputation and ended that career. I have been asked, and I've often pondered, why it was that posterity lost sight of Anna Barbauld when other women of the period, especially Mary Wollstonecraft, are sufficiently well remembered. There's no statue to Anna Barbauld on Newington Green. I don't have an answer to that, but for sure one reason is the outrage that flared in response to 1811. This poem begins, "Still the loud death drum, thundering from afar, o'er the vexed nations pours the storm of war." The loud death drum had been beating for so long that life had come to feel like perpetual war. Nature gave life in abundance. Man seemed dedicated to bloodlust, famine, rapine, and endless horrors. Just as she had urged Wilberforce to cease trying to shame the nation into ethical action, so Barbauld now ceased to believe the nation capable of progress and liberty. She was keeping faith with the old values, but they were vanishing. British civilization was disappearing. The world was collapsing. All that progressives had revered was being trampled. Ruin was all around. I quote, "Night, Gothic night, again may shade the plains where power is seated and where science reigns. England, the seat of arts, be only known by the grey ruin and the mouldering stone." This vision of England as a ruin extended to the whole of Europe and was offered with the force of prophecy. Empires fell, and Europe's moment had run its course. There was hope in this vision, however, for across the globe, in America especially, where discontented dissenters had emigrated and established roots, the best of British values could grow again. Barbauld imagined the young of a young nation being told about the old country and starting to come as tourists to see the sights, both spellings, asking questions, gazing at statues, viewing the rich remains of ancient art and the more recent evidence of reformers, writers, and scientists. These young would have been taught that Britain was a land to rank among the names that once were great. Their thinking would already have been partly formed by its influence, and they would learn that arms and wealth destroy the fruits they bring. That the reality of life in Britain and Europe in 1811 was, I quote, decay, fraud, crime, want and woe, and misery. In a rousing conclusion, she figures the movement of history as a spirit or genius. This spirit, having turned from Europe's desolated shores and travelled west, likes on the Spanish colonies in South America, where independence movements had kindled. Wrapped in storm clouds on the top of the Andes, the spirit bids the nations rise and throw off their oppressors. Quote, "Ardent, the genius fans the noble strife and pours through feeble souls a higher life, shouts to the mingled tribes from sea to sea, and swears thy world, Columbus, shall be free." Freed of European colonial oppression, in America would come truth, freedom, democracy, and equality. There would arise the newly enlightened civilization, an end to Gothic night. Well, perhaps in that she wasn't so prescient. Writing 1811 seems to have cheered Barbauld. If everything she valued was collapsing around her, she could still find energy by writing about it. In a letter to a younger friend, as she sent the manuscript off for publication in a 25-page quarto, she urged him to write something of his own. Quote, "Here am I, perking up my head like the expiring snuff of a candle, trying to make a little blaze, and I cannot bear that you, in the vigour of life and with your talents, should not be seriously engaged in something which will do you real honour." Alas, she was wrong about the poem doing her honour. She'd been wrong in some of her diagnoses too, for after 1811, things started to look up, and by 1814 and the Battle of Waterloo, the war with Napoleon was over. Even though Barbault's readers in 1812 didn't know that, they were still mostly disappointed in her, to use today's cant term, or actively hostile. To prophesy the country's ruin as she did was viewed as unpatriotic. After all, if it was treason to imagine the king's death, what did one call imagining the country's dissolution? John Wilson Croker in the Quarterly, later famously to attack John Keats, reproved her from a great height. He wrote dismissively that Barbauld had mistaken both her powers and her duty in daring to criticise military leaders, warriors. She had wandered from the course in which she was respectable and useful. And he added, I quote, this is John Wilson Croker, "We had hoped indeed that the empire might have been saved without the intervention of a lady author. Not such, however, is her opinion. An irresistible impulse of public duty, a confident sense of commanding talents, have induced her to dash down her shagreen spectacles and her knitting needles, and to sally forth in the magnanimous resolution of saving a sinking state by the instrumentality of a pamphlet in verse." Croker's masculine assurance, his condescension, might lead us to miss the fact that Barbauld was indeed a writer driven by an impulse of public duty. His low jibe about the shagreen spectacles and the knitting needles foreshadowed what was to come for lady authors in the Victorian era. But Barbauld had been born into better times for intellectual women. As a woman of information and knowledge, she was respectable and useful, had had a distinguished career, and when she began waging war on statesmen's misdoings, had been applauded for it. It was hard to remember that in the general disapproval that met 1811. So, in conclusion, Anna Barbauld retained her writing energies and her radical anger into her 70s, but it does seem that the Quarterly Review killed the public woman in her, the writer prepared to go to the barricades, the writer fired by campaigning energy, a sort of heroic oppositional ecstasy. Being mocked from a great height by Croker, being characterised in print as a little old lady whose place was by the fireside with her knitting, not on the public stage, not addressing the nation from a pulpit, seems to have shrivelled that powerful bit of her inner self. She fell victim, of course, to changing times. The repressive term against radicals in 1790s was a turn, too, against women in public life. This was true also of the literary industry. In the early 1800s, the heavyweight journals like the Edinburgh Review and the Quarterly were founded, and although women wrote for them, their clubbishness, their self-presentation was distinctly male. Croker's characterization in terms in which he opposed the content of her home comes directly out of that, saying she doesn't belong because she's a woman. There was none or very little of that rhetoric before. The fact that she didn't publish a major work again in the 13 or so years left to her through her 70s and into her 80s might be an effect of age, but does also sadly seem to have been an effect of this misogyny getting mainstream. Of course, as a creeping force, it had always been there. She had not confronted it as Mary Wollstonecraft confronted it. One might say she was suffocated and strangled in the end, and in posterity, by the poisonous thinking she thought she could laugh about and be above. She had thought she could share an essentially masculine view. You participate on men's terms. The masculine Mrs. Barbauld, the confident Anna Letitia Aikin, growing up amongst growing boys, thinking she could think like them. If 1743 was a good time to be born a girl like her, the early decades of the 19th century were less good for the grown woman she became. Even her brother, John Aikin, seeing the iron sway of force ruling all, had lapsed into disillusion and a kind of indifference. Sadly, as the state of affairs some of us understand more readily nowadays, when similar shifts from progressive optimism to Gefbrand's authoritarianism, the storm of war, or however you might like to characterize our present times, have taken place. We've got 5 minutes questions and comments. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful overview. Magnificent. I'd like to know if you could say a little bit more about the woman you mentioned several times, Mary Wollstonecraft, in terms of their back and forth relationship by letters. And I just have to add one tiny point of correction. The artistic work on Newington Green is not a statue of, but a sculpture to. No, see. Yeah.
Well, we have here Barbara Taylor, who's written about Mary Wollstonecraft. So maybe I should let her speak about Mary. Do you want to speak about Mary Wollstonecraft and Anna Barbauld?
Well, I didn't expect to say anything today, so but here I am. Norma and I have had some extreme. I thought that paper was fabulous. I really did. I thought it gave us insights into her politics that I have not had before. So I want to say that right now. I thought it was a wonderful paper. The relationship between the two women is very, very hard to trace. I should say that. I think that, if anyone is interested in my book, it's called Mary Wollstonecraft and the Feminist Imagination. And there's quite a lot about Barbauld in it. I found Barbauld riveting. And like Norma, I mean, it's frustrating to try and get access to sufficient sources. They were very different women. I mean, Wollstonecraft, when it came to America, for example, Wollstonecraft was a radical Democrat of an extreme variety, brinking on a kind of what we would call socialistic perspective. So when it came to North America, for example, Wollstonecraft is critical of the new American system for sitting on bags of dollars. She says it's all very well, you proclaim for democracy, but you still allow slavery in the United States, and you are still governed by the money imperative. On the question of feminism, I think Norma and I had arguments about this, but I think that it's true to say that Wollstonecraft's, I think it's fair to say belligerent. I love Mary Wollstonecraft. I'm devoted to Mary Wollstonecraft, but she was a satirical, and forthright doesn't even begin to describe Mary Wollstonecraft. And so on the question of women, she's very powerful on this. And of course, when Norma says, why is Mary Wollstonecraft remembered more today than Anna Barbauld, it also has to do with times, that feminism became a huge one. Mary Wollstonecraft, in fact, wasn't particularly well known until, she had sort of faded back until the 1970s. And then when feminists sort of looked around for pioneers, when I wrote my book on Wollstonecraft, there was a literature, but it wasn't huge at all. And now, it proliferates. So I just want to say very, very quickly that I think there are some, I don't have time to go into it now, but there are some straightforward disagreements between the two women. And I think that, I mean, if anyone's interested, you know, you can look at my book about this. And I think that I'm not obviously trying to sell it, but I mean, you know, because Barbauld was very concerned about the question of whether or not women speak as women or simply as citizens. Wollstonecraft did not think there was any distinction, but she thought it was very important that when women speak, the specificity of that has to be recognized. And, you know, and that the oppression of women has acted against them for so long. And it was just I think it was a different set of impulses. It was a different background. And, you know, and it kind of, this sort of ferocity of open past perspective isn't passed more in tune with the mood of, you know, the restoration and so on of the 1970s. So.
Thank you.